Welcome back to our discussion today. After Alan's sharing, we now have Dr. Simon Ng, Assistant Professor, Senior Program Director in Law, Hong Kong U Space, to share with us. Dr. Ng has published widely, both in Chinese and English, on legal culture, inclusive education, and rule of law education. Now we welcome Dr. Leung to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Yes, this is a project that we actually have been involved for, I think, over 7 years. We started our discussion in the Pacific Coffee somewhere in town, and it's quite a nice experience, and we are very glad that finally we've got something to present to the public and to the university colleagues and students. Very glad. Now, this morning is a very inspiring and enriching experience, and we had Benny to talk about the theoretical side of our project, as well as the highlights of today's topic on the relationship between the rule of law as well as democracy. I think Benny has highlighted 2 points that perhaps worth reminding, is worthwhile for us to keep reminding ourselves. The first point is that rule of law does have a relationship with democratic accountability. This is point number 1. And he kind of presented a diagram, showing the relationship between the two factors. And the other thing is, the other point he put forward was the relationship between law and culture, that law is not just a matter of rules, institutions, but more a normative system. Now, we have to bear in mind when we are, discussing and thinking about the topic today. Mr. Alan Leung speech is just wonderful, and the point that I just mentioned to Benny during the break, the very, very good thing that he has provided us with a very good skeleton, just like a submission before the court, which is really, really good for us to have a glance, a very well-structured argument, and his responses to the 3 questions, the 3 main questions that we had today. Now, I think he rightly said that he's actually very well placed in this discussion because of his dual role as a politician as well as a legal practitioner, a very highly regarded legal practitioner. And the experience he has shown, just very lively ones, like the arrogance that he experienced during his professional life, the arrogance that the official shows to him, he experienced, simply is a very strong statement that why we say there is simply no accountability, genuine accountability without democracy, and I think the experience, what we have heard this morning is just very stimulating, and I would perhaps like to try to provide just some simple responses and leave more time for the floor to discuss. Now, when we were discussing about what topics we should be putting up for our seminar series, we of course have the whole project actually is a very grand one. We try to do big things, but when it comes to democracy, I think I have to admit that the project itself, the questions on democracy, are not sufficient for us to understand the whole picture of the people's culture, of the people's attitudes towards democratic values. This is one of the shortcomings of this project. But of course, the main purpose of this project is not to find out how far Hong Kong people embrace democratic values, but more in a bigger, wider theoretical context of how people embrace the rule of law culture. We try to capture different aspects of it, if there is such a culture. Okay, so there's a limitation when we look at. We have to bear in mind those limitations when we look at the figures, when we look at the statistics, the data that we got from the survey. But basically, I think based on what we have today, the three main questions, we can identify three main sets of values. The first one is preference for competent leadership to good system. Whether we prefer a great leadership or we prefer a good system, okay? The second set of values is about paternalism. What do people generally think about their relationship with the officials? Whether they should make decisions for us or something else, we prefer something else. Paternalism. The third set of values is what I call utilitarian corporatism. Now, when we talk about representation in the legislature, we try to think it in a very kind of restrictive way, I would say, based on interest, and see how interests can be distributed. If we elevate a little bit to another theoretical horizon, we may conceive it as a kind of institution imagination, I would say. How our legislature should be constituted, whether through a genuine universal suffrage, without any sectorial divisions, or it's kind of like a hybrid system with some universal suffrage, plus some, corporatism that, you recognize some interests, some sectors important to the society, and you give them a entrenched kind of a seat, entrenched role to have some say or important, weighty say in the legislature. Okay, it's something to do with the institution building. So there are three sets of values, and what do Hong Kong people think about those three sets? And the internal and external culture. How do officials, how do legal personnel, how do people who are actually involving in the process would think about these three aspects, and how do the general public, the external culture, would say about these three sets of values? Now, and how far do these sets of values would contribute or disfavor democracy or democratization in Hong Kong? That is the problem we have to really think about. Now, if I put the data into a kind of very simple diagram, you will have this. We already discussed the figures, but just kind of reminding and see how through this simple diagram would highlight the gist of it. Now, regarding leadership, the internal culture appears to say that they prefer a good system. Now, just a note here, when we compare the internal culture figures and the external culture figures. Now, external culture, the data we gather were from telephone interviews, surveys, is random sampling through random sampling. So we can, I think, we can safely or say that these figures can be represented in percentage that somehow represent what the wider community would think about a certain question. But when it comes to internal culture, it's a bit tricky because it's not really a random sampling. Okay, if you are familiar with the sociological methodology, it's not really a random sampling. So that is, we try to be representative when we are selecting the samples. But at the same time, we have to warn ourselves that when we read those data, we have to be really careful when we compare, because that is not really a genuine reflection of the wider population. We have to bear in mind that we cannot say those, okay? We cannot generalize to that level. So we have to bear in mind. But at least it informs us to a certain extent about how the internal personnel would think about this thing. I would say, okay, we just take those data as they are, okay? When it comes to leadership, whether good leadership, great leader, is preferred to good system, internal culture, the data we had shows that they hold strong, okay? They prefer good system. Well, it's understandable, it's explainable. Like, when you're really working in the system, you kind of, have developed a certain attitude, a disposition to, to protect, to identify with the system, and to, tend to be, defending the system. So it's explainable, understandable, right? The external culture now is, according to the scheme just Benny put up, the well-established, that scheme, it is not established, right? People would somehow, we cannot say now, although the majority, relative majority, I mean, is not a 50%, but the relative, we have a significant number of people who would prefer a good system, but at the same time, we also have a significant portion of people who would prefer good leadership. Now, you can have a lot to say about questions like this, how people would interpret those questions, okay? The time, the context when the survey were done, okay? So, but if we take those data as they are, it is kind of like problematic, as Mr. Leung has rightly pointed out. He vividly gave an example, an analogy, that people are simply, take things for granted, like air and water, They don't think, they are just very normal to have those things, to enjoy those things. But they do not. The inconvenient fact is that they may not be that aware of the erosion, the process of having those values being stolen away by someone else, okay? So that is very troubling in a sense, that if we take the question as an indicator, as an indication of how people would prefer the rule of man against the rule of law, leadership, strong leadership, good leadership against good system, okay? That can be troubling. Now, the second set of values is paternalism. It seems to be quite safe to say that, it is what people disagree, either internal or external culture would give you that sense, right? It seems to be quite safe to say that we treasure equality, and yes, as we can read from the data that Benny showed just moments ago, the equality, the embrace of equality seems to be quite a fact now as reflected. So seems to be a bit more, we would have a high degree of peace of mind when we read this this set of data that people are against paternalism, which is good in terms of democratization, the building of democratic institution. Now, the third set of values, again, is problematic. Utilitarian corporatism. People seem to take a very restrictive and more instrumental kind of mentality when we look at representation in legislature. Universal values, universal democratic values would suggest that it should be an open, it should be a inclusive election, democracy. When we talk about legislature, representation should be based on citizenship rather than the job career, your professional sector, whatever. Now, although you can have valid argument for a corporate kind of legislature like that. Years ago, I don't know whether it's still the situation now, but in Ireland, when dating back to my good graduate school life, when I was studying, I had an MPhil in government and public administration. When I was studying a course under Mr. Andrew Wong, who was the ex-president of the Legislative Council, we kind of came to discuss given the fact that functional constituency is going to be a fact in Hong Kong, you are not going to remove it. How best can we do to reform or to make it more close to universal requirements like equality, like equal participation, And there was an example from Ireland, the Parliament of Ireland, that they do have a bicameral system, and one sector, one level of it is constituted by functional constituencies. Now, the way they defined functions is a bit different from what we take. Our definition for functional constituencies is very restrictive, based on careers, a particular kind of profession. But for them, it is a function. It is a function like it is the production, like the production sector. We have agriculture, we have industry, that sort of thing. And within a function, you have several seats. Now, all those seats, the candidates were nominated within, from within those functions. But they are being put to the wider context. So the general public, the citizens, would cast a vote to see which one would be returned, okay? Now, that kind of functional constituency, it never happened in Hong Kong. It was once proposed by the former president of the Legislative Council, but to no avail. But I mean, when we are talking about functional constituency or corporatism, when we come to this level of institution design, can we have more imagination, like trying to merge, trying to bridge the gap between the universal requirements and the so-called local political situation? But of course, to me personally, I would prefer a legislature that is fully based on election from the citizenship instead of any other restrictive kind of functional constituencies. But the statistics here show a very disturbing fact. That seems that the people in general still kind of think representation in a very instrumental way. They would try to recognize those who they think are important to the society to have more say, which is, to me, is against the values like, universal values like respect for diversity and inclusion, which should be, for me, should be based on citizenship, equal standing, okay, without any, qualifications as to your backgrounds, as to your status, etc. Okay, so these three sets of values project for me is mixed, is confusing, and to some extent is disturbing if we put in the context of Hong Kong now, especially when reform, institutional reform seems to be less likely nowadays after the umbrella movement, after the MPC-SC decision. Universal suffrage is something really remote for us. People now take to the street, and when we take to the street, we rely more on the cultural aspect. We try to see, are there elements, are there cultural factors that would contribute more positively to democratization, to democratic institution building. But given these three sets of data, a bit disturbing, because although we kind of accept equality as a core value within our system, but as far as good system, as far as corporatism is concerned, seems to be quite disturbing. Now, perhaps I would also just quote some good quotes for you to think about this issue. We talk about democracy. Many times we talk about it through the lens of institution, like voting system, like constituencies, how they are returned, the seats, how they are returned, that sort of thing, the institutional side. But democracy itself is also, if we, think of the issue at a certain kind of abstract level, it is also about participation in decision making. Let's forget about those, practical, more down-to-earth institutional design for the moment. It is about participation. It is about informed debate and choices. It is about respect for alternative views, about protection of minority interest, and the willingness, I think Benny would agree with me on this point, especially when you're talking about deliberative democracy, willingness to work towards understanding and agreement. Okay, democracy is not about segregation, it's not about fragmentation, it's about working towards agreement, it's about mutual understanding, it's about, it's about the whole citizenship instead of, favors, instead of sectorial interest, those narrow stuff. Now, this is a scholar, a champion, one of the champions in deliberative democracy. He gave a definition on democracy. Democracy connotes wide-ranging liberty, including freedom, the freedom to decide one's own course in life, and the right to play an equal role in forging a common destiny. Democracy means social and civil equality and a rejection of discrimination and prejudice. Now, civility. Civility is something that I think we kind of haven't got much discussion in Hong Kong. But fortunately, I think people are starting to appreciate the importance of civility after umbrella movement, although we have challenges like hatred politics. Now, democracy, carry on. Democracy embraces the notion of pluralism and cultural diversity. It welcomes a wide range of perspectives and lifestyles, moving different social groups towards peaceful coexistence or respectful integration. That, of course, would include groups like ethnic minorities, people with disabilities. It's about how we build our citizenship. Okay. Democracy represents the ideal of a cohesive community of people living and working together and find fair, non-violent ways to reconcile conflicts. In sum, democracy embodies all three elements of the famous French Revolution slogan: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now, this is a kind of non-institutional definition for democracy. Okay, you can find that definition in the scholars' celebrating book, Democracy in Small Groups. Now, another guru, Nobel Prize laureate, San, very well known, very celebrated in the area of welfare economics, and somehow he has been very committed during these years, especially with a political philosopher, Martha Nussbaum, that Benny had just quoted, to work on humanity causes. Now, his definition is, we must not identify democracy with majority rule. Democracy has complex demands, which certainly include voting and respect for election results, but it also requires the protection of liberties and freedoms, respect for legal entitlements, and the guaranteeing of free and uncensored distribution of news and fair comment. Even elections can be deeply defective if they occur without the different sides getting an adequate opportunity to represent their respective cases, or without the electorate enjoying the freedom to obtain news and to consider the views of competing protagonists. Okay, that is another definition of democracy. It is more human-centered, okay? Of course, we're talking about culture. All right, so to rephrase our problem today, the underlying principles for democracy can be perhaps summed up in, subsumed under these three underlying underpinning principles: pluralism, diversity, citizenship, and human rights. What law can do, what legal education can do to the general public, to raise their consciousness, to build ethos, and furthermore, to make an impact on our existing very tightly controlled, very tightly censored institutions. Now, that is a question, I think, that we should ask after seeing all those data, after seeing all those statistics, and after the very inspiring speeches that the two speakers has given this morning. So with that note, I would just conclude my discussion, my responses, and open it to the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Now we have about 15 minutes for some discussions across the floor. So you're welcome to give your feedback or ask any questions of any speakers. Hi, Gladys.
I'm very interested in the concept of utilitarian corporatism because it seems to me that society in Hong Kong is really driving, if I can put it this way, the predominant media interest in a lot of things that we value, such as the rule of law, is driving towards how much does it cost. Judicial review is expensive. Legal aid is expensive. So how much do we value? When we talk about the rule of law, are we actually just saying rule by law is what we value? But don't spend too much time on the process of actually giving people a determination on their rights. So actually what we're talking about is what Oscar Wilde said, we know the price of everything, but we know the value of nothing. And the other utilitarian corporatism view is efficiency. Is it working efficiently, which actually means quickly, not efficiently necessarily, because sometimes in the course of speed, what you neglect is the detail, and you neglect, if I can put it in the democratic process, the value of genuine consultation. Because we want a quick outcome, we need to decide where we can build housing, and therefore, the most efficient means is to find the space where there's least objection, right? So a soccer field, which the Jockey Club may have funded all the facilities. I hope the Jockey Club is going to object, because it's okay then for the Jockey Club to throw away $84 million for the use of this soccer pitch for 2 years because we need space for housing quick. It's okay to move villagers because they've been possibly illegally occupying the land, because it's much more difficult to get the sites which are also being illegally occupied in part. And this actually, eventually, it seems to me, causes the breakdown of law, because what you get is who's got the maximum power to prevent something from happening, and where is the least resistance coming from? Who are the powerless people? So what we go for is we go for the space that is occupied by the powerless people, and we leave the empowered but possibly illegal occupiers to carry on their occupation. And we don't even charge them for it, for heaven's sake. And Occupy Central, I think, was the perfect example, because here were areas that were occupied, previously occupied by motorists, okay? Because we're not talking about, of course, some pavement space, but it was space that had been allocated to motorists by the law. But who decided that the road should be so wide and allocated to motorists? And the reason I'm talking about this is, for the last 4 days, I have been attending the Walk 21 conference. And there's been very little discussion, there's been a lot of discussion about physical infrastructure and regulations, but really very little discussion about the soft side of it and how law prevents people from using public space. What are they prevented from doing? And who decided that the public space should be allocated to motorists? And when you allocate space to motorists, what do they want? They want more roads. They want more parking space. And that squeezes out the powerless who don't have cars, or maybe who rely on public transport, or who walk. Mothers pushing pushchairs, disabled people in wheelchairs, have less accessibility, less opportunity to interact, because more space is allocated to roads. So, I mean, this is pervasive, really, when we look at what is it that we value in society. So I think utilitarian corporatism is the key here. We're always talking about how much things cost, and we don't look at the intangibles. What do we value? I mean, frankly, if we had a system of resolution of disputes by coin flipping, if it were mandatory coin flipping, think how cheap that would be. You could do away with the entirety of the judiciary, certainly for the resolution of civil disputes, and you wouldn't even have to pay mediators or lawyers. It's just purely coin flipping. Now, that would be an ultra-efficient system, very low cost. Is that what we want? And if we decided whether people were guilty of criminal offenses by coin flipping, well, that's highly. So I think if you pose the questions in that way, you might get a better sense of what really is the value system, and is there really a cost that we are prepared to pay in money terms because we think these things are so important that we really shouldn't be constantly saying, how much do they cost?
Pooja.
Thank you again for presenting the findings of the study. For me, I think what really is interesting is how you tie sort of these formal conceptions of what democracy appears to represent for some people together with sort of what you brought in the end in terms of pluralism and diversity. And I think the danger is when we think about institutions and structures and you turn to the internal legal actors and external legal representatives to offer insights, it really comes down to me to what kind of experiences have they had in their life to be able to answer those questions about what democratic values mean to them. So if you ask me, for example, I would say that democracy has not served minorities very well at all. And that's because we unfortunately around the world, so this is globally, it's not just Hong Kong, we've taken a very formalistic conception of what democracy represents, and that's the aggregate of the will of the people. And it would be very interesting if we presented people with not such a pure vision of formal democracy, but rather said, this is how democracy should really operate, right? How do you develop an institution where you do not allow the tyranny of the majority to prevail, where you do not have the kind of corporate elitism or the sectoral interest represented in the legislature in this manner that is industry-based. And I was hoping that you'd go further, actually, and talk about how you can fruitfully utilize representation to give a voice to the disabled or certain minority groups. And the question is, how would the public feel about seeing their powerlessness suddenly be transformed into power by having a space in this institution, which is significant. So I feel that we've really only skirted the very broad values, but there are so many deeper level aspects which would probably touch on the intangibles, Gladys, that you're talking about. So when push comes to shove, who is really calling the shots about housing and access to justice, for example? And I wonder how the external legal actors would respond to that. The second thing that I was curious about, obviously, as you both mentioned, the sample of 35 in terms of the internal legal actors is obviously not meant to be representative, even though it's randomly selected. But I wondered whether you might get something richer if you were to do a focus group rather than a questionnaire-style response. Now, I understand that for comparison purposes, it's important to maintain a questionnaire aspect, but I really think you might get a very different view if you were to use some specific examples. To get the public to talk about the specifics rather than these generalities. I would find it, as your findings show, most people tend to agree on many things. But if you really go down to the nitty-gritty, it'd be interesting to see how committed people are to substantive equality and substantive rule of law. So this is getting into the thick rule of law and legal culture. And I think that's what really matters for Hong Kong at this juncture. Even China says it's committed to rule of law, right? But, what are we prepared to stand up for? What is the vision of rule of law that we want to stand up for? And I think there, I find that the public needs to really do some soul searching, where we can't just reflect on short-term gains that are personal to us. Oh, we all want universal suffrage. I think if we're going to think about overhauling Hong Kong's institutions to make them more rigorous, then we might as well go the full way and think about who have we left out in this process. And if we have the opportunity to rewrite the rules of the game, who would we now agree to include? So to me, that would be fascinating if that could be sort of a follow-on. Thank you.
Well, I would like to give a quick response to what Pooja mentioned. Actually, in our study, we did include questions concerning how Hong Kong people sees minorities, their attitudes towards discrimination. And also, our understanding of democracy actually is also not limited to just voting in election. And we do have questions talking about the possibility of coming into consensus. I think Simon has mentioned that. So we are organizing some more sessions and to cover those questions. And just to kind of report about the findings, that we find that, at least from the study, the Hong Kong people, they do want to reach through discussion, to reach consensus. They are prepared to talk with other people in setting the policy goals and also receiving or accepting different opinions. So that's quite encouraging from the results we have. So we could have a much stronger base to develop democracy, not just in the narrow sense about just election. But I also like Simon's idea that to the point about the Unitarian Corporatism. Maybe that's the kind of, I think Ellen has also mentioned a point that Hong Kong people may also kind of step by step to change the island model or some other form of election. I think we have to think out of the box to try to accommodate at the same time the interests, so-called the interest groups, their interests, and also the universal principles. Could we find a way to, as the next step, to establish our election systems? So that could be discussions not just about legal culture, it's more about the institutional design. But the institutional design must respond to the existing culture of the community. I think it could not be just reach it by one step. And surely we see our questions are the limits of our study. That this is just the first study we want to do. We were very ambitious, actually, at the very beginning. We want to ask, we call it it's just the upper level of culture. These questions we ask, they're just the upper level. Actually, that might be more foundational, that's a deeper level of cultural values. But just that we find that by asking the upper level, we have 70 questions. So if you have to complete this study, that if we ask 10 or 20 more, firstly, our research grant could not support that. And also, it will be very difficult if you receive a phone call asking you to answer 100 questions, then it will be quite difficult to complete the study. So we may aim at another study in the future about a deeper level. That's actually, we have included some of the deeper level questions in our study, but not comprehensive enough. And the theoretical framework is also lacking. That we try to refer to studies in cultural psychology and other areas that may bring us some insights into the the study of legal culture. That really is a project of interdisciplinarity. That is just not, we could not complete the study by just relying on the so-called legal resources. Focus group, we have considered that actually. In a way, this may be the first step of a kind of focus group, but surely it is not the best way. But in the future, we hope that we can have focus group to give, for example, we have people just discuss about the results, in-depth results, cite their own examples, and that may provide us more insights in completing the whole project. Thank you.
Any more questions? Actually.
I think the study was at least as revealing on the power of language as on what people actually think. So to take the most controversial question, the one about utilitarian corporatism, so whether interest groups should, interest groups that contribute particularly to society should have a seat in LegCo. I think the way it's phrased, it seems like, of course, like all interest groups should have a seat in LegCo, and of course, a fortiori, those with that contribute to society. And it's when you take it and flip it the other way and say, well, interest groups that are seen as not contributing to society shouldn't have a seat in LegCo. It's that, well, if you phrase it that way, then it would have obviously a very different response, I think. Which is not to undermine the study, but I think what it reveals is maybe it could help us to think about how, for example, the government propaganda might use language, the art of lying, or the 语音概算, so to speak.
Thank you. One more question?
I agree with Benny. It's more deeper value because I don't believe in utilitarian cooperation because every human being has an evil in it. Just what happened within the school, people have their own interests. I'm very disappointed with some of the legal leaders as well. Maybe utilitarian is everybody has their interest only. I do agree that policy, framework, or law play a very important role. But how do we use tools to enforce? Now we mentioned P2P finance, P2P whatever. What about P2P democratic using the IT platform? Because I have discussed, attend the seminar with Benny about faculty from the Texas, University of Texas, about using the GIS. So using just the leader is social movement, social justice movement to elect the leader. So when using the tools, so I think we can think on this area, just what happened, even within the faculty of law, there are lawyers around, but people have their own interests. I have my own interests. So how to avoid, I don't believe that we can eliminate discrimination. Even I discriminate others. So I do believe that it's not on one aspect, the lawyer role or the legal leader role. How can we design a fair system by using the IT now? I think the central occupation is good, but can we think more about that? It's not decided by specific leader or roles, but people-to-people democratic value.
Okay.
Thank you.
A response to the two questions about the power of language, that we are very sensitive when we design the questionnaire, that actually we have used it almost half a year to work out how we write the question. And we understand the limitations of the questions, and when we put forward that. Therefore, sometimes the questions are put in a positive way, sometimes the questions are put in a kind of negative way, not to have a pattern, because you have a phone call receiving, you have to answer 70 questions. We don't want people to respond kind of automatically to the answer, so it's always an agreed answer you want. So that's why sometimes we put it in a positive way, sometimes put it in another way, and because we are sensitive to the limits of language and also the power of language. To the question about the public participation, now the next topic for this series is, do Hong Kong people obey law? I think surely you know that what will be discussed in that seminar, and we'll surely be talking about rule of law and social movement. And we have Professor K.M. Chen coming to talk with me together. And so it's a very yellow panel. But we'll surely hope that you'll have a different views on the matter, and we have a good discussions on that. And actually, for talking about the organizing this series of seminars, we do want to have some other colors, especially some government colors in the panel. But just unfortunately, anything with my name on that you will find that, as Alan has already talked about, that everyone have to have a 10-foot pole to separate from me. So we could not have the government people coming to talk about, and actually a lot of our questions may need some kind of official responses. And but we hope that in the future we can, and also our publication, as mentioned by Alan, and also we promise that all the study and findings will be published and it will be accessible by the public. And surely if the public could use the data and then make requests or responses from the government, I think the government will have to respond. So that's about the how we could enhance the public participation in the whole matter. Thank you.
Simon,
Just one very quick response. Thank you very much for Ms. Lee's comments. I especially appreciate the way you distinguish price and value. That I think that is really critical for us, especially now in Hong Kong. There's a lot to do with our education, with our cultivation, if we do have cultivation. Yeah, I think it's really important. We have to think about it's inspiring, about the distinction. It's not about price, it's actually about what do we value. And Pooja's comment as well, very, very helpful indeed, methodologically and theoretically. And I think it would be, just as Benny has mentioned about the limitations of the research project, and I think it would be nice for us to perhaps, starting from this point, we further develop, like, focus group is one thing for sure, a good methodology, and also I would say, maybe we go down to the very street level, to the everyday life level, to perhaps have in-depth interview, or even ethnography, like how a marginalized group of people, or people with disability, or ethnic minorities, they experience the legal process, like maybe being prosecuted, or caught by the police, or whatever. That is so valuable. I mean, information and research data are so valuable. If we can somehow develop a project like this, that would greatly inform us about what is actually at the very, everyday level, everyday life level. What is all about rule of law, apart from those big grand concepts, what do they mean to the ordinary people? Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. So with that note, I guess it's a good time to conclude today's meeting. And as Benny has said, our next session will take place on the 22nd of October, in 2 weeks' time, also on a Saturday morning. And I hope that you will come again and share with us. Thank you very much for your coming.
Thank you.